So, good morning, everyone. I am Aparajita Banerjee. I used to work in UCD since 2018 to 2023, so 5 years, and then I moved to Germany. So, and there I work with IDOS. So, it's the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, but I don't know why it is called IDOS. So, it's some unknown reason they call it IDOS. So yeah, but the funny part is previously it was called DIE, which means die. So that was funnier. So yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about myself, my research and my institute as well, and I will it's not like self-promotion. There are reasons why I will do that. And then I will talk about the topic of just transition, and I will present to you two cases of a just transition case in the global north and the global south. So in order to make people in the room understand that it's a just transition is a challenge both in the north and the south. And then I will kind of give you a conclusion. So it's kind of like, giving you a sneak peek in what goes on in my head, and also to share with you whether I am understanding the problems properly or not. So I would like to discuss that as well. So who am I? I'm an environmental sociologist. I began my academic career as in economics, and then I moved to environmental sociology. I went to the US. I am from India, but I went to the US to do my PhD. Then I came to Ireland to do my postdoc, and now I have moved to Germany. So while I was doing my PhD, I did my one case study in US and the other one in Mexico. Now I work a lot with the global environmental governance like UNFCCC, UNCBD, UNCCD, and the UN SDGs. So it's kind of like understanding the global. Why do we do environmental policy? It's a lot of global pressure on countries to behave in a certain environmental way. So that's what I see. And then when I go to the local country-specific context, I see how is that pressure manifesting in the local levels. So that is kind of, and for that I have done work in the US, Mexico, Ireland, India, Vietnam, and a few African countries as well. So let me talk a little bit about IDOS. IDOS is a think tank. It does independent research. The whole idea of IDOS is after US, Germany is the world's biggest donor country for foreign aid. So what we do is that we critique the government and we give them policy suggestion that this is how you do development cooperation in the global south. This is what should be done. This is what should not be done. So that's kind of our work. So mostly our research is funded by the German government, but then again we try to maintain our scientific independence as well. IDOS is also an exciting place for early career researchers all over the world. We have a bunch of training programs specifically for participants from the global south. There is a postgraduate program for EU participants. There is an MGG program which is for participants from select Asian and African countries. Shaping Futures is totally for African participants. So we also support PhD students. So they work in IDOS as PhD students. So there is also that, and then there is also different vocational training going on from time to time. Most of these programs are funded by the German government. So if you are interested, and the best part of IDOS is that we are just neighbors to the UN campus. So we have a great access to UN, IUCN, IPBES. So if you really want to know what is the world in global diplomacy, environmental diplomacy, IDOS can be a great way of introducing you to that. So this is about IDOS. Okay. Now let me come back to my research. So why the whole thing about going renewables, doing away with fossil fuels actually began with the Paris Agreement, when countries actually ratified the Paris Agreement and agreed that we have to do something to reduce our CO2 emissions. So what was decided that, like, with time, countries will close down their fossil fuel industry, and they will also, like, remove the subsidies. Like, our fossil fuel industry in every country is highly dependent on government subsidies. So they will stop the subsidies, and that way fossil fuel will be competitive, and then, like, renewables will win, and then we will, like, our economies will shift from fossil fuel to renewables. And that's the reason there is also a lot of, like, incentives and subsidies given to the new forms of energy like wind, solar, tidal, geothermal. And as we heard from our previous presenters, there is a new need for, like, minerals and metals. We have to also rethink our way of how do we transport, how our transport systems are designed, and also how individually, what do we consume, what do we don't consume. So we have to rethink about that. But in all this, there will be winners and losers. There will be people who will be negatively affected, and there will be also people who will really benefit from from this transition. So the whole idea is that, like, okay, when people are winners and losers, then how do we make it just? So we have to, like, a history of just transition comes from the US labor movement. So in the 1972s, like 1970, Rachel Carson, who is an US environmentalist, she came out with I think 1960 something, she came out with the book called A Silent Spring. And from there is this whole idea of understanding the human impact on the environment. And from that, eventually, during the 1970s, very important UN legislations were passed regarding protection of the environment. So when that was passed, the workers in the UN chemical industry, they realized their jobs will be very negatively affected if the chemical industry is closed down. So if you read the environmental history of the US, there was a time when the rivers were actually on fire because of the amount of pollution that was there. So that at that time they realized, okay, we have to do something, and for that the workers will also suffer. Not only workers, people from communities of color will also suffer. So this is where the history of environmental justice, actually, if we track it back, this is where it came from. It was born in that history, labor and communities of color, and also communities of lower socioeconomic status. So how can we not be doing injustice to those people? So this was happening in the US. It was kind of content in the US, but then when the Paris Agreement came to force in 2015, the International Labor Organization, they also came up with the idea and said, oh, we have to have a just transition all over the world. It's not just that the US workers will be affected, fossil fuel workers all over the world will be affected. Communities all over the world will be affected. And then there was a lobbying. So in the international diplomatic arena, there's a lot of lobbying going on. So there's a lobbying happened from the ILO, which is also an UN organization. And they kind of included the term just transition in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. So it became a very important document, or a very important term for all people, because it kind of gave you a term with which everybody could connect. So that's the reason just transition is such a popular word nowadays. And then eventually this concept started growing, like from 2015 to currently, like in the past 9 years, just transition has been talked about in every possible field. So just transition in textile, just transition in water, just transition in transport. So so what it means that, okay, justice should be done to people whenever we are transitioning from one form of system to another form of system. So that is kind of the uniting word. So now that was the beginning. Now things are going much more farther, like, they are going farther, and people are saying, oh, we are not just, interested in giving like, you know, just transition to people, we actually have to change the system altogether. Like, who has the power, who has, like, you know, the supremacy, who controls the government, what structures of consumption and productions do we have in this in our present economy. So we have to change everything. That's kind of the call from mostly the activists and the community organization. That is, like, you know, that is the ideal world we should work towards. So that is now the current state of the art of just transition. So this is very radical, and we all who want to be radical, we really kind of love this kind of a model that, okay, we will change the system and we will create a new world. But we know also that it's not possible to do it overnight. It's a very gradual process, and for that we need certain hand-holding. Like, you know, how do we do it? Like, you know, what are the basic where we should start with? So then the scholars kind of came out with the idea that, okay, we have this excellent theory of social justice, which has a very, like, you know, big history of like 60, 70 years. Why don't we learn from social justice and use it in the just transition context? So there are, like, you know, three big justice elements in social justice literature, which is distributional justice, procedural justice, and recognition justice. So what they said is, like, you know, we can think about distributional justice in just transition by saying, okay, the allocation of cost and benefits should be fair to all. Procedural justice, we should also help everybody to participate in the decision making. And recognition justice, we have to, like, you know, have fair engagement with the diversity of cultures and perspective. So that is where we can situate just transition. So, and for that, what is required? We have to align our policy making, we have to align how we are governing just transition, and also, like, you know, inclusive participation, and we have to focus beyond jobs. So previously people were only concentrating on jobs, but now we have to focus a lot more, because when we have to bring in policymakers, we have to bring in the governance, we have to expand our territory beyond jobs. So that is where now we have kind of, like, you know, what is the present understanding of just transition. We also, like, Kete and I also did a little bit of research, and we also found that spatial justice is also an important element of just transition. What it means is that if just transition has to happen in a place, that place needs to be prepared to have that just transition. So if the coal industry is going from one place or one region, it also has to have an alternative industry there in order to help people to get those jobs. So that is important. In my current research, I also see, like, restorative justice is also an important part of a just transition, which means that we have to also be cognizant about the harm that we did to the people, their past, and how the, you know, our industrial structures have kind of made people, like, they have cut people from their past, and they have, like, they are in an isolated time frame where they have no connection with the past, because our industrial structures have created a barrier with their past and their present. So we have to also understand that, like, how are we delinking people from their past and how that affects their present. And I will kind of show you a case to explain this. We have two papers on this. If you're interested, you can, like, you know, go and look at these two papers on just transition, especially in the Irish case. So I will talk a little bit about the Irish case. So Ireland is a country where, like, you know, if you go to the history of Ireland, it is one of the countries in Western Europe which was colonized by UK, and during that time Irish people suffered from extreme energy poverty. And what they did was, traditionally, that they used to have peat in the land around their home, and they used to cut that peat, dry that peat, and then heat their homes. Ireland is a very cold country, especially in the winters, and it's also very, like, you know, wet. So it's very important for people to have access to a lot of, like, cheap energy. So they use peat to heat their house, and it's very traditionally Irish, as I think, like, Paula in the first day she was explaining, like, if you go to rural Ireland, the air really smells of peat all the time. So it's very important to, and what happened that after independence in 1914, the government decided, okay, we can't continue to depend on the peat from the coal import from UK. So what we do is that, can we use the peat that we have in our country and use it for thermal energy? So peat became a replacement of coal. So that way there was a big peat industry that evolved in the Irish Midlands, and a lot of people locally got jobs. The best part was that it was also, the country was a newly independent country. So the engineering, the pride in the peat industry was immense in the local communities, that we are doing something to build the country. So that was kind of like, in the heartlands of Ireland, peat was a big industry. And it continued till 2019, when, due to the Irish commitments to the EU that they have to reduce their fossil fuel industry, the peat industry was suddenly closed. So the government kind of decided, we will close the peat industry. It had immense bad, worse, it impacted the local environment a lot. So they decided, we'll close the peat industry. So what happened was, all of a sudden, all these people who had this history with the peat industry, who worked in the peat industry, they lost their jobs. And the communities were dependent on the peat industry. They also found, okay, we don't have, our economic system is not there anymore, because the workers don't have jobs. So it affected a lot of people, and this is a kind of a picture of what peat does to the landscape. So if you ever get to visit the Midland region of Ireland, you will get to see this kind of landscape, where it looks like somebody has kind of scalded your skin, and it's brown everywhere. So it's very common. But if a peatland is intact, it would look very beautiful with bog flowers and everything. So people are used to both, having good peatlands and also having this kind of landscape there. And so then the government decided, we will do something called just transition plans, and the reason was that peatlands, there are hectares, thousands of hectares of peatlands, the peat has been taken away from those lands, and they are still lying like this brown field. So what they decided was that we can convert this whole area into wind farms. We can find areas which will be suitable for wind farms, and we can convert them. And what they promised was that will create a lot of local jobs. People will be working in the wind farms. So that was one of the plans of the government. And then there was also once this was decided that the peat industry will close down, the European Union also funded a lot of money to the Irish government in order to do a just transition in the region. So these are kind of, there's a lot of details about this, but I'm just going through very over the top, but you can always ask me questions. So then we found, we went to the communities and we talked to a lot of community members, and we found that, some elements of just transition was there in that plan. In some way, there was some kind of reskilling and retraining program that was given to the workers. There was some kind of procedural justice as well, because there was a transition commissioner who was kind of having regular discussions with community members. And there was also restorative justice in the way that a lot of money was invested in bringing the peatlands back to their original state. But it's a big process, it's a lengthy process, so a lot of money is needed. And then also with time, the peat industry actually closed first, and then in 2 years' time some funds were allocated, so it came retroactively. So, but then when we talked to the local community members, we saw that the procedural distributive justice was not they didn't think that there was complete distributive justice happening there, because not all stakeholders were kind of consulted. What would happen to the pensioners? They were kind of forgotten in the system. But this is a semi-government company, so they have a long pensioners, and if the company is no longer in business, then the pensioners were worrying about their pensions. And then there were some, as they said, there were training programs, but the training programs were not according to what the the people thought they would need, like what they thought. Like imagine a 55-year-old person, like you can't ask him to, like imagine our parents, like can we go and ask them, like you train in some certain ways all of a sudden. So they were very attached to their jobs, so it was very difficult for them to kind of even take the training programs that were offered by the government. And also like these communities are like in the Irish Midlands, they're very like traditional communities in the sense they have never hardly moved away from their local area. So in Ireland, we all say, we who are from outside, we always say that there are 2 or 3 degrees of separation, like everybody knows everybody in this, some way you can connect. So for them, leaving these communities with strong like, kinship was very difficult. So even if they had jobs in some, urban areas, they wouldn't find it easy to kind of move and get those jobs, move to the new areas to get those jobs. So they were very used to having like local jobs in their community. So that was one of the big problems. And also like when we were doing our field work, we found there were lots of rallies going on, there was a lot of like campaigns going on, and like people were actually not like ready to like, with the sudden closure of the peat industry, and they all said that, oh, we were not made aware, you could have come and talked to us that you are doing something like this. We have worked in this company for generations, and we think that we were part of that company. Why didn't you come and talk to us? So it's like, imagine our family, somebody takes a big decision like selling the house, and nobody is coming and talking to everybody. So they felt very left out. And also during this time, like 2019, end of 2019, beginning of 2020, we all were hit by the pandemic, and people were like absolutely clueless of what is happening. The only relief that was there was that like, the government gave a lot of relief to the workers because they lost their jobs and nothing could be done. So government handouts were given to these people. Government handouts is good till the extent that you are not kind of like, these are very proud people who are very like, proud of their work they did and everything, and you are just giving them handouts. So it might look that we are doing a great service to the people, but it might not necessarily align with the pride they have in their work. So that was also very problematic. And so as I said, there was like, not all stakeholders were recognized. There were also like, renewable jobs, as we know, are very limited. Like we all know that renewable energy industry, the manufacturing happens somewhere else, and the wind farms get installed somewhere else. So the jobs are essentially in the manufacturing industry, and that doesn't happen within the country where the wind farms are coming up. So that kind of a promise also was not true, because only the wind farms give 10 to 15 jobs to local people, not more than that. And also there was an inadequacy of skills. So wind farm jobs require specific skills, and it's not necessarily a person who is a tractor in the peatlands would go and do a wind farm job the next day. So it is a mismatch of skills as well. And also there were some jobs which were created in bog rehabilitation or rehabilitating the peatlands, but those were also not as well paying as that of the peatland extraction. So we have to imagine, we are like, previously they were selling something which was making energy. So this is an energy, something which, like, imagine oil and gas. It's a very expensive commodity because the world runs on oil and gas. But now they are not selling any commodity, they are actually rehabilitating land, and we don't, in our economic system, we don't have any value of environmental services. We don't value environmental services in our economic system. So there's a shift in the model of what they were producing. So then, like, I will share one quote of one of the interviews. I said, no matter what you get, you will never replace the industry, which means Bodamona, which is the peat industry. That's my view. Okay, the other thing is, suppose wind means wind energy. There is scope for wind, but it's not going to create employment. Solar, there is scope for that as well, but it's not going to create long-term sustainable employment. I don't know, it's going to be very hard to replace employment in the Midlands meaning the middle of Ireland. So this is kind of my like, Irish case in a nutshell. So what the government is kind of like, focusing on is the economic impact. What will happen in the economy, how do we create jobs. So perhaps the renewable energy industry will create jobs. But what is not getting translated in the policies is that the huge socio-cultural and spatial impacts of this peatland jobs, the peat jobs in the Irish Midland area. It's place attachment, it's feelings of pride, sense of place. So these are not things which we can quantitatively give a monetary value to it, attach monetary value to it. And so that's the reason a lot of this is forgotten. And now the communities, when you talk to them, they talk about these things. They talk about a sense of place, sense of justice and all these things. But the government is not understanding because you can't quantify these terms. So there is a mismatch of communication between what the government is saying or what the EU is saying and what the communities are feeling. And then when we talk about just transition, they would think, oh, there is an injustice in everything because you are not listening to us, because the language in itself is very different between the two kind of parties. So this is kind of my Irish case. Now I will go to my Indian case study. So recently I went to India to do a field work in the coal areas of India. So if you know a little bit of India, the Indian energy system is very dependent on coal. At least I think more than 60% we are dependent on coal. And what happened was traditionally in certain areas of coal, a lot of land was taken from the local government, local people, and they were changed into coal plants. So we do our our own self, like we have coal mining, and then we also use it in our thermal power plant. So I went there within the coal areas, and there is this community which I didn't know of before, but I got to know about them when I started my field work, who are the Paharia communities, which Paharia means mountain people. So they are the mountain people, and when they were the local aboriginal groups of this coal area, all the land was theirs, and then when the state decided we will extract coal, they took the land from them and they converted into coal mines. And these poor communities, they didn't even know that they have power or any kind of protection. They just gave away their land to the government because there was a mismatch of pressure. They didn't have any kind of political power. And it's very interesting how this community has continued to live in areas within coal mines. So they still live in coal mine areas because that's their land. Their traditional practices are attached to their land. So they couldn't move out from that. So this is one very interesting case where mining is also happening and the communities are also living there. So yeah, so I was thinking of how do we do just transition to these people? What do they understand about it? So I saw how do people survive on margins? What happened is that they don't have any kind of, because their land is gone, so what they do is that they go down to the coal mines, they steal coal, chunks of coal, and then they keep this in the roadside, and then some middleman will come and buy the coal from them, and they will transport it to the local local market, and they will sell that. So this is one form of survival to them. So their resources, they are just going and stealing that, and they're selling it in the market. And yeah, so these are very common scenes there, where people survive in this way, and that is kind of a way that their communities are. So they are the original owner of the land which is producing so much of coal, but they continue to live in a very poor kind of condition. And yeah, so I'll give it I have never been to a coal mine before this, and it was an eye-opening experience for me, even though I grew up in a coal region. So their land is in front of their eyes. Their land is getting converted into something like this, big trenches of mining and everything. And there is a lot of water pollution. So this region is extremely drought prone. People take a bath every week, or that too they have to come down from the mountain to the rivers to take a bath. But there is water holes. These are existing mining areas. this is filled with water, but they all know that they can't use the water. They are very concerned that this water is actually also polluting their water table, so they can't even use the wells they had because this mining water is leaching into the aquifer and they're polluting the wells. So there is a water crisis, and what the government has provided is that they have given this like water tank, which is filled once a week for water supply to the entire village of 800, 900,000 people. So they get 2 buckets of water daily and you can use it however you want. You want to wash clothes or prepare food, so that's your call. But this is what you get. And I saw a lot of land degradation happening. So this is a mine which is still active and expanding. So the trees, they were like, we saw this kind of tree cutting going on. And this is a woman who also helped me in my interviews, was that like, she's standing and that's the end of her, like, her land. And down there is the mine, the mine. So it's a place where people are living their life. And it was very like eye-opening to me is that like these white spots which you're seeing are dynamites, like it will go off in certain time period, and they are that land which is producing so much of coal, while these people are kind of like they cut wood, firewood, in order to kind of like for their energy. So this kind of dichotomy is going on there. And when these dynamites kind of go off, and while I was doing my interviews, it's like 6 point something earthquake happening. So the earth shakes, and every day for at least two times the earth will shake like that, and they're so used to it. Like they started laughing when I was like, "Ee, what's happening?" And so like for them it was pretty cool to have their earth our earth shattering experiences every day. So, and what I also found was that because there is no longer connection with the land, the male population of the region, they were going to the local urban centers, and I saw village after village with either widows or with women. So I first thought I will be interviewing both genders, but then I found that I can only do some work with the women because very few men I could talk to. So it was mainly these villages where women, either the men have gone for urban work, or they have died from working in the mines or some form of pollution, and also alcoholism because the lack of not having a future locally made them take to alcohols, and alcohol is locally produced, so it's not expensive. They can produce it from their natural resources, forest products. So what I found was that burdens and benefits were unequally distributed. It's very obvious, and there are many stakeholders in the coal industry, and these are I would say the least important stakeholders, because even though this is their land, they're forgotten. So they don't have the power. They don't have anybody in the policy making. They don't have a representative in their local government as well. So they are forgotten. Their problems are forgotten. So how do we give a just transition to people who don't have a voice? So that's that, and they also have lack of power of self-determination. So they genuinely don't think that they actually matter. So they are very okay, for a long period of time, if you tell a person that you don't matter, if you gaslight a person that you don't matter, you will forget that I really matter. And this has happened to the community as well. They are learning to understand, okay, they also matter. So that self-determination is gone. And then we always think of democracy. For me, I question, because I am educated in the Western world, when I take democracy for granted. And then when I go back, I see, okay, democracy is not that easy in these contexts where people are not aware of their democratic rights and responsibilities. So it's a very different story there. And when we talk about cultural norms, traditional, tradition, social norm, you are disconnecting people from their culture, their traditions, and for a long period of time, 30 years, a mine is in place for 30 years, you're disconnecting people from that land. What happens is that people slowly forget those. They just get so busy with their own life that they just forget this. And when we then go back and say, let's do just transition, what are we trying to do to these people? Where do we connect them? Because they are the past, which was so important to them. They they have kind of forgotten that. And what the government of India is doing, that is like, we have to develop this like vulnerable groups. We have to do something so that they go to school, they get the jobs and everything. But in a sense, what it is doing is that the Paharia people are being taken out from their roots to become people just like us, who are educated in schools and everything. So what we are trying to do is we are disassociating people from their traditions, and we are making them everybody is urbanized and everybody is Western educated, and that should, and in a way we are ending their traditions and cultures and everything. So yeah, what I was telling, the other thing is that when we live in a place which is highly polluted, it makes us a very different kind of people. It's not easy to live in a polluted state, because we know we can't grow food, so we have to depend on government welfare systems in order to get food. So in a way, we always become dependent on somebody, and when I went there in the community, they expected that I will give them something. So everybody is a giver, what benefit are you giving to me? So that changes you as people, you are getting changed. So and they are so dependent now that their traditional ecological knowledge that they have of growing food, of cutting, depending on land, those knowledge are they are going extinct. So when so much is lost with time, with time we are losing so much, how do we do a just transition? And when I was doing this, there were these reports that the reality of coal in India is so big that we can't begin to think of a renewable transition at least currently. And it's similar in Vietnam, also in many other different countries, and I kind of will look into that later. So when you think of just transition and just sustainability transition and everything, when I think of this as myself as well, I think of the story from India. So there is this big elephant, and there are 9 blind men, and they are blind. So they were asked to touch the elephant and describe the elephant. So the person who was touching the trunk of the elephant, they said, oh, it's a snake. And then who were touching the teeth, they said it's a spear. And then the people who were touching the ears, it's a fan. The body, it's a wall, the legs were like trees, and the person who was touching the tail was like a rope. So some people kind of understood the elephant in very different ways. When we talk about just transition, we are also a blind man. We don't know the big story of what is happening. So the elephant is there, but we are not being able to see it. What it is actually, that it's such a big system. So whenever we see just transition, we think, oh, this is how we should do it. With this, it's a rope, so we should find solution for the rope. But we often fail to see the big picture and the interconnections, and I think that is the challenge. So I would like you to stay, keep this elephant story always in your mind, in order to understand that the challenges that we have are so huge, and we only know very small parts of it. So just to see the big picture. So thank you very much. Thank you. And yeah, here are my details.